The World Bank wants Nigeria to continue importing fuel instead of depending on the local Dangote refinery commissioned 2 years ago, and Nigerians are not happy about this. Let's explain. You see, this year, Dangote Refinery hit three milestones. First, it hit its full 650,000 barrels per day volume. Second, it struck a new deal that significantly increased the local crude oil supply to the refinery. And thirdly, it struck partnership agreements with more African countries, supplying them with refined fuel amid the global oil shock. It is because of these milestones that Dangote announced that his refinery will now be expanded to 1.4 million barrels per day capacity, including building an equally large refinery in East Africa. But as usual, Washington doesn't like this, neither does Europe, and this time, their mouthpiece is the World Bank. Now, America is putting pressure on Nigeria to reopen the oil market to fuel imports instead of relying exclusively on Dangote. Their excuse is that it would introduce competition, which would then lead to reduced price for petrol, making the commodity more affordable to average Nigerians. Sounds good, right? Well, not all that glitters is gold. The real question is, why now, and what is really at stake? Let's find out. The beginning of the refinery. This is not the first time that America and Europe have attacked the refinery. In the early days of this massive industrial complex in Nigeria, Dangote faced numerous challenges. When the refinery was launched in 2024, the West African cargo-based trading hubs in Lomé and offshore transfer markets slashed the price of their refined fuel by almost half its actual price as a way to price Dangote out of the market. For context, when fuel is imported from Europe to Africa, they are stored in reserves and depot systems in West Africa before distributing to the necessary countries. These depots fix the price of fuel within the region without local competition until Dangote Refinery challenged their dominance. If they placed fuel at $80 a barrel, then that's what Africa would have to pay for it. So, by pushing the selling price down, they aimed to make it difficult for Dangote to operate at a profit. When that didn't stop him, another roadblock was initiated: pressure related to crude oil supply. Nigeria refused to supply crude oil to Dangote. The paradox here is almost laughable. For decades, Nigeria exported crude oil to Europe and imported refined oil in return, spending about $10 billion annually on imported oil because the government couldn't handle local oil refining. The same amount of oil being imported would have cost the country about $7 to $8 billion if they'd been refining it locally. So the country was essentially burning $3 billion annually for decades. Now, when Dangote launched a refinery to help refine the local crude oil and save the country at least $2 billion a year, they still refused to supply crude oil to him, still exporting it to Europe and importing refined fuel. This was not entirely the government's fault, though. The reason for this was contractual agreements that had existed years before Dangote's refinery. The Nigerian government pointed to existing supply commitments with foreign oil companies in Europe that prevented them from selling to Dangote. And most of these foreign oil companies operating in the local upstream sector were also unwilling to sell crude to Dangote. To explain it better, the crude extraction in Nigeria was mostly handled by foreign companies, and the reluctance of these international oil companies to supply crude directly to the refinery was covered under the Petroleum Industry Act framework, which meant the oil companies had to prioritize the contracts they'd already established with outside companies. So what they did instead was to route the crude oil through international traders, which increased the cost of oil that ultimately bled back into domestic fuel prices. All these bottlenecks forced Dangote to import crude oil from Asia and America instead. Imagine having a company aimed at refining crude oil, but you cannot even get your own people to give you what you need because external powers are preventing them from doing so. Can you imagine? Even with these obstacles, he still pushed on, but more challenges awaited him. Fuel distribution bottleneck. After refining, Dangote tried to sell the refined product locally, but it was difficult to distribute his refined fuel. Again, the excuse given here was contractual. Distributors claimed that they already had long-standing agreements with the foreign oil companies that imported fuel to the region, so were contractually obliged to get fuel from those companies and not from Dangote. That is, the refined fuel Nigeria was consuming was still contractually tied to the fuel imported from Europe. So, what did Dangote do? He invested in 10,000 LNG trucks to distribute his own fuel locally. Upon all these obstacles, many fuel stations still wouldn't receive fuel from him as they'd been informed against it by the National Petroleum Company. This prompted Dangote to expand his operations by building around 100 fuel stations to support distribution. Now, just to be clear, the Nigerian government was more than willing to support Dangote's enterprise. He has gone on record multiple times to applaud the government's efforts. It was the previous administration that inaugurated the launch of the refinery, and the new administration, after removing fuel subsidy, mandated the National Petroleum Company to supply crude to Dangote. So, it's not like the government was completely against him, but it was external forces with huge oil interest in the region and deep pockets who didn't want their billions of dollars exploit to vanish overnight, who threw large sums of money to local saboteurs to derail the project. And one of the methods they employed was smear campaign in the media and other allegations. Allegations against Dangote. In the early stages of the refinery, two of the claims leveled against him were of poor fuel quality, which he debunked by demonstrating the clarity of his fuel compared to those imported into the country.
This one is the gasoline, this is the PMS. You can see the diesel, because I'm sure most Nigerians, they have never ever seen this color of diesel. But this is what you call Euro 5 diesel. It's less than 10 ppm, sulfur-wise.
In fact, at the time, fuel imported from Belgium were resulting in a lot of broken engines in Nigeria. Tens of thousands of car owners in Nigeria lost their cars to bad fuel imports, forcing the Nigerian government to ban a specific supply chain from Belgium.
So you are now going to have, good petrol. You'll not be having an engine issue, which a lot of us were having, it won't happen at all. The quality here will match that of quality of anywhere in the world.
Another accusation they threw at him was of monopoly. But this is also a funny one, because until his refinery came online, Europe had almost a complete monopoly over the local fuel supply chain, both the upstream and downstream sector. Crude drilling was mostly handled by European companies, then exported to Europe to be refined, then imported back to Nigeria by Europe. So the claim that Dangote was running a monopoly was just founded on fear. Interestingly, after Dangote started his refinery, many local billionaires jumped on similar ideas and started building their own refineries, like the BUA refinery being built by Abdul Samad Rabiu. This is also forcing the Nigerian government to fix 3 of its languishing refineries, all thanks to Dangote's unwavering efforts. With all these hurdles thrown at him and how he successfully navigated them and expanded his distribution of fuel, not just locally, but to over 10 other African countries, including now supplying fuel to Europe and Asia, the Nigerian government has finally started supplying double the initial volume of crude to him. Did you miss what we pointed out? Yes, Dangote is now supplying refined oil to Europe, a supply that has increased by manifolds since the global oil blockade. The same continent that was putting pressure on African oil supply chain is now heavily relying on Dangote's refinery. Talk of irony. All that aside though, now that Nigeria is increasingly relying on his refinery for domestic supply, the World Bank is advising Nigeria to reopen the import market. They frame it as a good thing, but if you peel back the layers, it's much more than altruistic. The World Bank angle. They say Nigeria should, and we quote, reopen the PMS market to competition, arguing that Nigeria's suspension of petrol import licenses since January 2026 has reduced competition and allowed domestic prices to exceed import parity levels. Now, let's add a bit more context. You see, in January, many of the contracts of the international oil companies operating in Nigeria had expired. So Nigeria, to protect the local oil sector, initiated the suspension of petrol import licenses. This gave Dangote Refinery enough latitude to refine and supply locally. Please, have in mind that since the launch of this refinery, fuel queues, which used to be an almost daily occurrence for decades, had been eliminated. Meaning no more fuel scarcity, a thing that was almost a corrupt business, where importers would reduce the supply of fuel, cause panic, and as people rushed to buy the scarce petrol, the prices would almost double for a period of time. This corruption has been eliminated due to the introduction of one giant mega refinery. The only thing left to eradicate now is the high cost of fuel and the price fluctuation, which is almost getting stable. The reason given by the World Bank is that fuel import restriction has reduced competition in the downstream market, since Dangote Refinery now supplies most domestic petrol. They argued that local fuel prices can be higher than what imports would cost. Now, this is not completely true, because Dangote doesn't solely set the price. It is something influenced jointly by NNPC. Also, his refinery is constantly audited and scrutinized. World Bank is framing imports as a way to create price pressure on domestic suppliers, so consumers are not dependent on a single large refinery, which sounds good on paper. But as Nigerians pushed back on the idea, the World Bank issued a statement saying the goal is not permanent import dependence, but a more competitive downstream market over time. The main question here is, why intervene now? This is almost hypocritical. The World Bank didn't intervene when the Shell oil company was poisoning the Niger Delta. In fact, when activists spoke up, Shell lined the pockets of some political elites to make the activists disappear. Remember Ken Saro-Wiwa? You know the famous episode from the TV show Suits about an oil company's shenanigans in Nigeria? That's how widespread the oil corruption was in Nigeria, that it was popular enough to warrant an entire season in a popular TV show, depicting their manipulations in Nigeria perfectly. For over 30 years, there were almost 7,000 oil spillages in Nigeria that ruined the lives of tens of thousands of locals and displaced over 70,000 people. This is a region of fishermen who couldn't fish because of oil pollutions. The farmers couldn't farm because the soil was toxic. Let's not even talk about the air from all that flared gas. The water contamination levels was so high, it was deemed an environmental hazard akin to a genocide, over 900 times above the global standard of safety limit set by the World Health Organization. Yet the World Bank didn't step in then. They didn't issue emergency reports or make any conditions for these European companies. Also, when the same European companies sold substandard oil to Nigeria that led to hundreds of thousands of car engines breaking down, where was the World Bank when Nigerians cried out? We must remember that the World Bank and the IMF are run by Americans and Europeans, so their interests will always lie in the countries that control them, not Africa. And losing $10 billion worth of annual oil revenue, this isn't something they're just going to take lying down. Dangote has pushed back on these statements by the World Bank, and Nigerians have also attacked it, forcing the World Bank to withdraw their statement. Because, at the end of the day, every win for one African country is a win for all of Africa. And step by step, the continent will achieve sovereignty.